Martin Brophy is the former president and CEO of Shen-Heights TV, which served Shenandoah and the surrounding area. Can you tell us how that company came into existence?
Well, in 1950, my father started Shen-Heights TV along with Albert Krinsevich. And they realized the need for television in the valley of Shenandoah because it sat between the mountains and it couldn't get TV reception via antenna. But of course, at that time, there were only 3 basic channels from Philadelphia. The Wilkes-Barre Scranton stations were not up and running yet. So my father and my godfather got the idea to erect a tower and run a cable down to downtown. And they ran it to a bar in downtown Shenandoah as an experiment to see if it was going to work. And it did. And the rest is history.
Nowadays, we can take excellent reception on TV for granted, but in those days, that wasn't the case. So try to let our viewers relate to what the conditions were in those days and why it helped to put the antenna on top of the mountain.
Well, in those days, people had antennas on top of their houses, and they would have like what they would call a rotor that they could, from the top of their television set, maneuver the antenna around to see what kind of signal they could pick up off air, which there weren't very many signals available at that time. And when my father started, we only got 3 from Philadelphia, NBC, CBS, and ABC. And then Wilkes-Barre Scranton got involved, and then you got NBC, CBS, and ABC from Wilkes-Barre. On a really foggy night, you might be able to get Binghamton, New York, if you were really lucky.
Now, when the company started in the 1950s, where was your dad in his life at that point?
Oh, he was probably midlife, about in his 40s. And, or no, it was late 30s, I guess, because he had
What had he been doing for a living?
Well, he came out of the war. He came out of the World War II. And he was really started into veterans organizations. He was organizing a lot of veterans organizations. He started the ANVETS, American Vets. Post number 1 was in Pottsville, and post number 7 was in Shenandoah. And he went on basically statewide, organizing a lot of ANVETS posts in different regions for people who came out of the service.
So you said your dad and your godfather got together, and what were the forces that brought those two together for this business venture? And it seems like a lot of business ventures, especially an innovative one, there could be some risk involved. Well, tell us about that.
My godfather was a Yankee fan, and there was no way to get Yankee baseball off an antenna. So that's what hatched my father and him trying to figure out how they could get baseball down to the general public. And sometimes it was successful, sometimes it wasn't. But eventually, you know, over time, it all worked out.
So that was his main motivation, was to get those Yankee games.
That's exactly true. At that time, the Phillies games were not being televised, you know, that readily like the Yankees games were. And everybody was a Yankees fan at that time. And I basically was a Yankees fan in the beginning until now I'm a diehard Phillies fan. But that's the way it went.
So tell us about all the work that was involved. I mean, obviously, it takes some time to put a tower on top of the mountain. And then you got to run that tower to the homes in order to give them cable TV. Talk about the labor that's involved and, of course, the cost.
Cost was the big factor because for them to get started, don't forget this is in the 50s, money was not exactly what you would call free-flowing. And no banks or anybody wanted to lend them money because it was a new industry. They didn't know what to do, you know, what the pitfalls were of it. So he had to go to relatives and friends, and as did Albert, had to go to relatives and friends and ask them for monetary assistance, which they got. And through that, they were able to erect a tower. They were able to purchase land in the cemetery, basically leased it for a while, erect a tower, and they found a television salesman, quote unquote, who became their engineer and helped them to formulate the business, which at the time we used to call it a shack, but it's the antenna site.
Right.
But it truly was just a shack where you would walk in and all the amplification equipment was in it. But My father, like at night, would go up, switch it over to New York channels and back to regular channels, you know, when there was a game on or something like that, if they could pull it in. And it was, you know, that was my first hands-on experience. I used to go up the tower with them and do it.
So what kind of excitement was created by putting that tower up in the mountain? In other words, could people at the base of that mountain look up and see that tower and say, that's going to give us good television reception?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Every time. It towered over everything because it was the highest point on the mountain.
Yeah, how big a tower was it, roughly?
It was only about 75 feet high.
It does sound relatively short.
Yeah.
So the mountain does most of the work?
Right. Today's, you know, you have to be above on the top of the mountain, so the distance for the tower to be built doesn't have to be that high. And it was like an H structure, not a straight tower like you see today. It was an H structure. And I provided them with the flexibility to mount multiple antennas, thereby aim them in different directions for different stations as they became available. When we, in the late 50s, we branched out to WGAL Lancaster. That was an NBC station, and they did everything they could to help us out in perks and things like that to offer to customers to sign up, you know, like ashtrays and things like, you know, tchotchkes that they usually give out. And
I remember the ashtray with the Conestoga wagon on it.
Right. And those things they used to hand out. And that's how we started. We started with 3 channels, went to 5, then to 12, and then we eventually went to 26. And then now it's at like hundreds.
How long did it take to put this whole system in place then before people could enjoy the benefits of it and get 5 channels? Which again, by today's standards, isn't a big deal, but back then, that must have been special.
By the first, when they first started this, to get the first 50 customers took about a year and a half. And then it just expanded after that. They could only, you know, like I said, money was tight back then, and you could only do so much as the money you had. So, and that's how they expanded as they got the finances available. Then they kept going, expanding. Did
customers need to be persuaded to take the plunge, or maybe some of them were saying, it's about time, I'm ready to pay money for this service?
Well, most of them said it's about time we'll pay for the service, because they really had no, you know, you don't want to put a 75-foot tower on top of your house. So this way, and not only that, when you had wind, rain, snow, hail, sleet, whatever coming down and blocking your reception on your house antenna, you didn't want that. So we took the brunt of that. We you know, took care not to get our antennas iced up or things like that. But it was a learning curve, you know, as like anything else when you start out.
Yeah, what were some of the lessons or the obstacles maybe you didn't anticipate in the early days?
Well, what you didn't anticipate in the early days is the reamplification of the signal. You could only go so far before it had to be reamplified. Well, in the early days...
You're serving the surrounding community anyway, but it was still an issue to have more power?
Right. Right, and you're using all tubes, don't forget. You're not using like transistors or anything like that. So tubes burn out. So you had to go replace the tubes. And then the location of these amplifiers, so-called amplifiers, were at times in people's homes. They were in their basements. So for reciprocation purposes, you would give them free TV for the right to use their basement.
Oh, I see. So that amplifier could help get cable TV to several other houses,
right.
And then you gave them a break.
Right. Yeah.
Now, tell us more about the physical network involved here. You said the tower was on top of a mountain, it was only 75 feet, which came as a surprise to me. How much cable? Did you have to run coax cable? I mean, we all became so familiar with what a coax cable was.
Well, the coax cable then was not coax cable now.
Oh, what was the difference?
My father realized what the cable was when he was in the service, because he used to climb poles and things like that in the service. And it was like Army surplus cable that they were using. It had a copper jacket and didn't have the styrofoam center that it has, but it had a copper wire in the center, which was the conductor for the signal. Right. And, you know, today you couldn't go with fiber. You can go miles with fiber. Well, then you couldn't. You could only go like maybe 1,500 feet. and you'd have to re-amplify it. So the physical restraints were really something else.
Now, the first day, the community was able to get 5 channels, and that's what you were able to go to right away.
Right.
And what kind of feedback did you get from the cable? I mean, again, maybe it's hard to relate to today, but that must have generated some excitement in those days. So what were you hearing from your customers? And maybe there were some complaints too.
Oh, there were more than enough complaints over time.
Let's start there then.
It wasn't a pure science, but
yeah.
A lot of the first customer that they had was Albert's Bar. Naturally, they ran it to Albert's Bar to make sure it worked.
Public place.
Yeah, and everybody seemed to like it. But then, as you branched it out into individual homes, it was like, well, maybe this is not going to be so hot at only 3 channels, you know, till you offered more, you know.
Right.
Then the acceptance became greater.
So at first, at least you had excellent reception on 3 channels,
Right.
which was an improvement. And I'm sure there's plenty of PCN viewers that never had to deal with an antenna on their house or the attendant problems that came with that. I mean, there's all kind of jokes about adjusting rabbit ears on TV. And like you said, there was a mechanism that could turn the antenna that was mounted on the chimney, perhaps.
Yeah, well, we had.
And this was a whole different environment.
Right. We had a slogan for our 50th anniversary. We had from rabbit ears to digital years. You know, and that's how far we went.
Very
because
good.
it was from rabbit ears, literally, to a digital format, which is today what we now use. But back then, it was 75 years ago. It was really different.
Now, you were talking earlier about getting the funding for a project like this, and it does involve innovation and taking a risk, obviously. You said some of the funding came from private sources. Sounds like not much came from the bank. How much funding came from banks? Were they willing to take a chance on cable TV?
In the beginning, no. A lot of it came from private sources, and as they expanded the system, and the amount of money that they charged for hookups and things like that generated the revenue that they could build the system out further. But then eventually banks took a chance, but you know, it was pretty tight, you know, on how they would get funds. But the banks eventually came around, and they saw the light.
Now, tell me more about your dad. Around the inception of this company, you said he was a veteran. He had been in the Army. So, did he know that this was going to determine how his life was going to go for the immediate future? That he was all in on this this project?
Oh, he was definitely all in on it. When he and Albert got together on it, they decided that this was going to be the thing.
Was Albert a Yankees fan too? I know your dad wanted to see those Yankee games.
Albert was a great Yankee fan. He knew a lot of umpires at the time and a lot of Yankee players because he used to go to New York to the games. And he was a bartender at this bar that he had. And a lot of people would always talk about the Yankees, and we couldn't get them. So that's what precipitated this whole deal.
Marty, what did expanding your bandwidth do for your service?
Well, by the expansion of the bandwidth allowed us to offer more channels, and it opened the door for digital and internet, which today is where everything is at, the internet. You know, it just broadened the pipeline that goes to the consumer. And it gives the consumer much more opportunities to enjoy more services.
So when you took over in the late 60s, about how big a company was it? How much had it grown since your dad's early days of the 1950s?
Well, in the 1950s, they had maybe like a couple hundred customers at the time, and it gradually got up to like 3,000-4,000 over time. And when my father passed away in '65, I think we had 4,200 customers. And when we sold the business in 2013, there was 3,900.
Well, that sounds ambitious, all right, growing from hundreds to thousands, and then you got to make updates to the equipment in order to accommodate all these people, right?
Right. Well, that was the thing. We always kept advancing with the technology. We didn't let the technology advance over top of us. We try to keep in step with what's going on, of the latest innovations, because if you don't, you'd get lost in the weeds.
Now, when you were president and CEO, just how big was the company? As far as the office was concerned, how many people were working there?
We had 9 people. We had 4 people.
That sounds relatively small, given that you were serving thousands of homes. That
Right,
was
well,
only 9 people.
We had 4 road crew and 3 office personnel, and myself and another manager.
Now, what about programming itself? As far as the late 1960s was concerned, how much had it changed, again, from your dad's day in the early 50s?
Well, in the early 50s, programming was accessible any way you can get it. But as time went on, then everybody had to start paying for programming.
Right. I mean, what was the programming, Marty? What were people watching in the 50s, and how had it changed by the 60s?
Well, basically in the 50s, they watched NBC, CBS, and ABC. That's all you had. Then all of a sudden, you had public broadcast television. And then in the 60s, we had PCN, you know, which was the public educational station at that time, which was a great demand because a lot of people wanted that. And then when we went to satellite, then you could get like arts and entertainment, Bravo, and things like that. The genres just expanded over because the bandwidth expansion and the availability of programming. But along with that availability came a cost, which naturally had to increase the price that you charge the consumer, which the consumer didn't like, but what were you going to do?
So it's interesting to consider that the foundation that was laid back in the 1950s for cable TV, you said the bandwidth was expanded, so that allowed for the internet. So you were kind of preparing for the future back in those days.
Correct. That's exactly what we did. We didn't want to just sit back on our laurels. We wanted to move forward with you know, the latest technology. Because when we launched our digital program, we had a nice little program set up in a restaurant where we brought in a big screen TV, and we showcased our new advanced digital platform that we were about to launch. And we had all the township supervisors, the borough council people, all the important people there to let them know what we were about to do before we did it, because we just didn't want to roll it out and nobody know what it was. This way, if any of the customers or their constituents asked them what's going on, they would already have known what to expect.
Now, as far as expecting innovations in the future, we didn't know what the public didn't know what the internet was going to look like back in the 1960s. And yet somehow you were laying down a foundation for this, well, it seems like a big unknown.
Well, it was. And, you know, like, technology moves so fast. It moves terribly fast. And the problem with it is it's capital intensive. And for a small cable operator, it's really hard to do that. I mean, you have to make certain adjustments. You have to adjust your billing system. You have to adjust your expertise, all kinds of things.
And tell us about the rest of your family. When you took over the company in the 1960s, who was in your family and what was everybody doing? And did you know that you would eventually settle into cable like your dad did?
I didn't know that because when I was going to school, I was going to college to be a teacher. Oh. But then I wound up in the Army, and that didn't work out. But I have 3 brothers. All of my brothers were involved in the business with me. My one brother was my engineer. The other one was my construction manager. And we had, like I said, the road crew that we had. Yeah. And the office personnel were very good. Interesting story. I don't know if you've ever heard of Mrs. T's Pierogies.
I have, in Shenandoah.
Right. Well, Mr. T was married to a gal named Jean, and she used to work for my father. She left Shen-Heights when she married Mr. T. And we've become very close.
Mr. T, not to be confused with the guy on TV in the 1980s by the same name.
Exactly, right. And unfortunately, they both passed away just not too long ago. But they were very good friends of the family and, you know, of Shen-Heights. When we used to go to school and we needed we'd be short a nickel to get on the bus to go home. We'd stop at the office and Gene would give you the nickel to get on the bus. I mean, those are the kind of things that you always remember. Like,
sure.
When I was written up in Cable Fax magazine, the reporter asked me, "What's your worst experience?" And I said to him, I said, "Well, I've always dreaded the Super Bowl and things like that, because you never want to have an outage during a Super Bowl.
The pressure is to deliver that Super Bowl.
Right. Well, the one year, I forget the year, but it was Baltimore was playing in the Super Bowl. And it was the beginning of the third quarter. And all of a sudden, nothing but snow on the television set. My heart dropped, and I thought, oh, God, what happened? So I immediately ran out of the house, and I was getting in my car to go to the antenna site because I wanted to see what happened. And I could hear my neighbor yelling, "You better get this back on, Brophy!"
As you were dashing to your car.
As I was dashing to the car.
That is funny.
Unfortunately, it was just a outage of a power supply. So we managed to get it fixed rather rapidly. But
So it was your
cold.
equipment, but I bet you were hoping it was not on your end, weren't you?
Right. I was hoping it was their end.
Exactly.
But, you know, you deal with a lot of things like the weather conditions and everything like that. And that day was really, really cold. So, you know, the weather has an effect on it.
Well, come to think of it, did the weather have any effect on that tower that was on top of the mountain we've talked about a couple times?
Oh, it did. Sometimes if you'd have a heavy snow, you'd have to make sure that, you know, the antennas didn't ice up on you. So somebody had to go.
How do you de-ice it if the thing is 75 feet high?
Yeah, climb up and knock the ice off. You can't blowtorch it off,
Right.
and you can't put.
So one of the 9 employees gets to climb that tower.
Yeah.
So it must have been pleasant to have your family involved in the business here. So talk about that whole dynamic and how it made it maybe nicer and maybe cozier,
Well,
with the family working on the same thing.
It was a truly unique family experience. You know, all families get along really well. You know, so it's tough to do because you never leave work. It's like it's always taking it home. Always take it home with you, wherever you go. And like being from a small community, everybody knows you, wherever you go.
Right.
I mean, you can't walk down Main Street without people saying, "Hello, hello,
Right.
how are you? When are you going to fix the TV?"
Exactly. Like your neighbor was yelling at you to fix the Super Bowl.
Right, exactly.
And as far as the future is concerned, are there things you look back to back in the 1950s, or rather when you took over in the 1960s, that you could have done differently? Is there anything that you could have fixed along the way? It's easy to have 20/20 rear vision, of course.
There probably are a lot of things I would, if I had to do it over again. But, you know, I often think about that. If you change something, go back and change something, then it alters everything going forward.
Yes.
So
that sounds like the plot of a movie, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, I don't know if I would, I probably would want to change a couple things, but I don't know if I would.
Yeah, it's interesting to contemplate what you said a minute ago, that you take the work home with you. Certainly when you get home, you turn on the TV, that's you.
That's it.
So you're kind of constantly monitoring your progress, aren't you?
Right, constantly. And like, I have a habit to this day, checking all the channels out. I mean, I don't know why, but I do it. It's just the instinct. You know, you want to make sure they're all on the air. Because if you go through and you're missing one or two, want to know why they're not there. You're going to pick up the phone and call somebody and say, you know, Fox News isn't on now, or something else isn't on now. How about why? Is it the station's fault? Is it our fault? Or is it something in between us and the station? You know, it's like you're your own policeman.
So what did you personally get out of the 40-some years you spent as the president and CEO of Shen-Heights TV? Was it fun for you?
It was fun. It got to the end where it wasn't fun. It got to be really laborsome. In the beginning, it was fun. I met a lot of really nice people. I made a lot of good friends. That's what I missed the most in the industry, the camaraderie with all the people. I mean, I still stay in touch with a lot of them, like Joe Gans and others. But I mean, I've learned an awful lot from the Gans family, from a lot of people who've gone before. And I watched a lot of people try different things, and if it worked for them, then we would do it. If it didn't work, we would stay away from it. You know, and I figured I'm not going to be the guinea pig. I'll let somebody else be the guinea pig and see if it works. If it works, then okay. If it doesn't, we'll try something different.
So new cable pioneers get together and have some conversation. What does the subject usually turn to? Is it the old days, or relating what we have today to what you did in the old days?
Well, it's kind of a mixture. It's kind of like nostalgia at first, and then nostalgia is overtaken by the present as to what it is today and how it can be either better or worse. Mm-hmm. The pitfalls of it and the rewards of it.
Martin Brophy, former president and CEO of Shen-Heights TV. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Larry. Appreciate it.